Welcome to Virtual Voices, everyone. We are really excited to be talking about such a hot topic and such an important topic about back to school. We are really thrilled to have some wonderful speakers, but I'm going to start with just a few updates. Virtual Voices is something that we created to ensure our alumni stayed engaged during these virtual times, and we've hit a lot of important topics, and we will continue to do so as long as there is desire for this. You'll see some Zoom reminders on your screen. We are recording. We ask you to stay on mute unless you're speaking. If you have questions for our speakers, or if you want to share resources or any thoughts, please use that chat feature. I will call you out once you have a question, and you're welcome to ask that out loud, or I'm happy to ask it on your behalf if you'd like. We do recommend Speaker View, found in the upper right-hand corner. If you need any help with anything, Megan can offer that help. Thank you, Megan. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. We simply could not do the work we're doing. Engaging our incredibly impressive 5,000 list of alumni takes work, it takes effort, and because of Molson Coors Beverage Company, Southwest Airlines, and TIAA, we actually are able to do more of this kind of outreach and education. So a big thank you to these partners who have meant a lot to this community and a lot to us at the Leadership Foundation. And then I'd like to introduce our speakers. These are three truly amazing people. We are very lucky to have these three with us today. These days are very busy for them. And so allow me to introduce you to them. Susana Cordova, of course, brings us 30 years of experience to her position as the superintendent of Denver Public Schools. She's a lifelong Denver resident, as am I, so cheers to us natives, and has worked in DPS schools at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. Cordova believes in the power of our schools to transform the city. She says schools have the power to build a more equitable future, and we must create equity for all children, not by accident, but by design, so that we may nurture them to grow and achieve at high levels. I stand behind that, and Susana, we're so thrilled to have you in your role and also on this call. Thank you, Susana. And we have Mike Miles, who is a leader in education reform and the former superintendent of Dallas Independent School District and the Harrison School District in Colorado Springs. He is the founder and CEO of Third Future Schools. It's a charter network based on fundamentally different principles of operating schools. As CEO, he devotes his time to creating schools that significantly narrow the achievement gaps and prepare students for a year 2030 workplace and world. And prior to this education career, he served as an Army officer and later in the US State Department as a diplomat to Poland and Russia. Mike, you're tremendous. We're so happy to have you here. I can't wait to hear more of your perspectives. And then we have Elizabeth Reyes. We are so happy to have Elizabeth, not just because she has a wonderful name. Of course, that's mine. But Elizabeth is a graduate of Dr. Martin Luther King Early College and a soon-to-be Sun Devil at ASU. She's actually leaving, I hear, just hours after this call to drive to college. So congratulations to you. We're thrilled to have you here. She's a Minds Matter student, the subject of a recent CPR article that's really wonderful. She's been a student representative for us through Minds Matter at our Impact Denver Education Day. And something I think it's important to note, she is one of the first of 6 children to graduate in her family. So we are just thrilled to have you here, Elizabeth. Thank you for being a part of this. And I'm going to start with you. And actually, before I start with questions, I would love to ask everybody who's on this call, if you would for us in the chat feature, could you please just give us a mention of why are you on this call? Why do you care about the topic of being back to school? I'm a new parent, a 2.5-year-old, 11-year-old, or 11-month-old. We're not quite to school yet, but I'm really interested in learning more about this. So give us in the chat feature, why are you here? Why do you care about back to school? This will be helpful for us to just understand who's on the call. And so Elizabeth, I'm gonna start with you. You are leaving for college today. Tell us about this experience of being a student through COVID and what it is that you hope to experience when you get to college.
Yes. Oh, actually, I don't leave today. I actually leave Saturday. I have to wait for my COVID testing back to technically check into my dorm. So I'm waiting on that because I took it here in Denver. But this was my senior year. I spent my last half of the semester of my senior year dealing with COVID. I guess you could say it was just a weird transition. It was a very weird transition because it went from, I was literally at school on Thursday. I can remember this. I was at school on Thursday, regular day, and the next thing you know, they said, and I actually was working at my school. So I worked as a DPS paraprofessional with special education students because there was a student to para pipeline that they're trying to do with DPS, and I was like, this is like the first year it launched, so there was 5 of us, and I was part of that, and literally I have to go to like all the meetings. So any staff meeting there is, I have to go. Any type of like after school, just a regular meeting, like I have to attend those.
Looks like you muted, Elizabeth. There you go. You're off mute. Keep
Sorry.
going. That's
And
okay.
our principal had said, she was like, there's a possibility that within like the next few days, next week, school will shut down due to like hearing about the cases. Because I remember hearing there was a case in John M.S. where like 2 students' parents had tested positive for COVID. So that's like right down the street from our school. So at that point, we just thought like, okay, we're gonna have to like prepare next week for, you know, packets to send home with kids, things like that. And we were preparing for that Friday because our teacher said, well, maybe next Monday we won't have school. So Friday is just going to be one of those days where like you just like plan and you kind of like, you know, let the kids watch movies and you just like get packets ready for them to take home. Friday never came. Friday, we got a call Thursday. We were just told like, hey, school's canceled. We won't go to school anymore. Like after spring break, maybe, because our spring break was like 2 weeks later. So we were having 1 more week of school and then spring break. And then they were like, well, maybe after spring break, everything will die down. Like, you know, we might come back to school. There's a possibility. So then it was kind of just like playing it by ear. And then we found out Polis was like, well, no, we're not going back to school at all. Like, that's the end of the year. But like, you guys are still expected to like do your work and stuff. So in a student's perspective, it was kind of hard, you know, for someone like me. I'm an in-person learner. I don't like virtual learning. Like I have to have a teacher in front of me, directing me, telling me this, like helping me out because I'm a quick learner, but at the same time, when I get stuck, I get down fast. So if I don't have a teacher there to correct it that minute, I don't like waiting for an email or like waiting for a text message or a call and then being like, hey, like having that on hand, like learning, just having my teacher there. It's so beneficial to me because then I click on like quickly, and then when I click quickly, I'm able to move on quicker, and then I'm able to get the material faster. But having it where you wait and then you're on a virtual call and your teacher has to look at the comments and there's only one person teaching and looking at the comments, you don't get those answers right away. Like you have to wait for her to look back and be like, okay, well, you guys got stuck there, but you're 2 hours past when the lecture was happening. So I guess in that way, like for me personally, just that kind of like transition from going from pre-K all the way up until 12th grade, first semester where I'm in-person learning, and then that last semester, it's like you got to figure out how to graduate, you got to figure out how to pass your classes, you got to figure out how to do your senior checkout all while you're at home doing nothing. You know what I mean? Like you're at home, you know? And it was also another responsibility on me because I have to like help with my family because at that time my tia is an immigrant, so I had to like step up and help, you know? So it was one of those things where not only did I have the pressure of trying to graduate and get my diploma, but I also had that family pressure where it's like my tia doesn't have papers, so now I have to step up and get another job and work 20, 30 hours a week and also get my schooling together. So a lot of times it would conflict, but like, so that's another thing. It's like very difficult when you have those family responsibilities, but you also have your own responsibilities that you have to take care of. And I feel like that's like one of the biggest pressures at my school just alone. Like all of the seniors all had to get a job or two in fast food and at Walmart because those were the places that were hiring, but also figure out how to maintain their grades and get all of their work done, if that makes sense. But yeah, it was just one of those like trying to grasp the concept of online learning, but also trying to not be disappointed by what's going on because it's not just our school, it's literally the whole entire world. So, I mean, in that way, it's just one of those things. It's like a weird concept to understand because not even like my grandparents or my parents have ever heard of shutting down everything and staying at home and being inside and wearing masks to the store. So I feel like it was just one of those, like, it was just a really confusing, weird transition that was like very hard, but I guess in a way, like once you got the hang of it, it was easier to grasp. But like to this day, it's still one of those things where you're trying to figure out what's going on. But yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, you're certainly a part of history and a time that we're all learning together. And you know, you made it work. You graduated and now you're off to ASU, which I think I read you're doing because they have in-person learning. So hopefully that experience is one that is really wonderful to you. So thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to move on, Susanna, and ask you a question as well. You know, this is what I'm sure I'm certainly dying to know. I think others might be too. What does it look like behind the scenes at DPS headquarters? Leading up to this decision, you know, this is one of the most challenging times in education probably ever. So how are you balancing the needs of teachers, students, parents, school administrators? If you could just give us a look at your world.
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about how we're making decisions and some of the complexities of what we're grappling with. For those of you who don't know, in the Denver Public Schools, we serve over 93,000 students across district managed, innovation, and charter schools. We're incredibly proud of the collaborative relationship we have with our community and with our schools. And the pandemic really has thrust us into a very new space where on a daily basis, we are all grappling with making decisions when frequently we don't have all of the information we need, and the rules change a lot based on new information that comes out all the time. You know, when we were moving into the extended spring break, as Elizabeth shared, we really had no idea that we would be facing something like this for the amount of time that we are. And it has been incredibly challenging. We work very closely with local health officials and are trying to be as responsive to changing information as quickly as we can. I believe that it's incredibly important to be able to get students back into school learning in person. And one of the things that will be very important for us to be able to do so is the creation of a framework that looks at public, transparent data to give an indication of where we are in terms of the pandemic. That's something that we've been working on with our local health experts through Denver Health and the Denver Department of Public Health and the Environment. And it's something that I think we need across the metro area so that we really can be making decisions that are based on science, that are based on data, and that help alleviate the concerns that people have. And I have to just name, like, people are concerned across a spectrum. So there are the people who are like, it's not safe until there's no COVID-19, and the people who are saying, you're crazy, you need to be back in school right now. And I think we need to be able to explain and describe what data we're looking at, what the thresholds are, and based on what science, and how we can have plans to effectively keep our students, our teachers, our school support teams and leaders safe, particularly because we know we don't live in a bubble. People will come into school and go back home. We need to be able to implement those plans effectively for the good of the community. So we're working really hard to begin to bring students slowly and gradually back in person to practice those safe protocols and to use a decision-making matrix that's based on health expert guidance.
And that's all made more challenging because even the health experts don't know yet, right? We're learning, we're all learning as we go, like you said. So I know it's a big challenge ahead. Thank you, Susanna. Mike, I want to move to you. You stand pretty firmly behind the belief that students need to be together at school learning. It's a lot about what Elizabeth said too, is that's how she learns, right? And a lot of students need that. Tell us why that's important to you and how your schools are ensuring achievement and what achievement means to you. And you're on mute still.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for inviting me to speak to this group. We've been in school for summer school. We had 6 weeks of in-person classes with social distancing. And we're now in our second week of regular school. So we're almost at 8 weeks in school with in-person, with social distancing. We've had only one possible case of COVID-19 student testing positive. And I say possibly because they never brought in a sheet or confirmed that they had been actually tested. They had flu-like symptoms. Anyway, so we've been in school and we thought it was very important. And before I go to the achievement question, I think the question to ask everybody is how essential are we? How essential is public education? I hear that we are. I think we are. I think after medical professionals and maybe after EMTs or first responders, we are the most essential organization in society right now. And so if that's true, that means we have to figure out a way to operate. It's like if a nurse is that essential, there's not even a question whether hospitals will operate. And nurses may have their own, sense of what their risk factors are, but they have to make that choice. But the hospital as a whole has to operate and figure out how to keep their staff safe while they still operate. And so that's our premise for opening our schools. We're going to open if it's possible to open and do it safely. And we think we have. In fact, we have been safe for 8 weeks. And doesn't mean we won't have other positive cases, because the next essential question is what degree of risk are you willing to tolerate? If you say as a system, we're not going to tolerate even one person getting sick, then that means you don't close or open at all. That means you stay at home and you treat the virus like the whole system has to close down. But in Midland, Texas, where we have another school, they wanted us to wait to open, but we had Walmart was open. The restaurants were open at half capacity. The grocery stores were open. And so I said, no, we're not going to close because we're going to be the safest of all those institutions. And we're way more essential. And so that's why we believe kids need to be in school, especially our population of kids. We have a lot of kids on free and reduced lunch. They come to us behind in their proficiency, even prior to COVID. And so those students, many of them need direct instruction and in-person instruction. And so the question for us is, can we do it safely? And the answer is yes. As far as achievement goes, I think the question really hits the nail on the head in that our goal is not just to be safe. I mean, obviously we're going to be safe, but our goal is to get 1.7 years of growth in 1 year's time. I don't see many other districts, present company excluded, talking about achievement. Many of my colleagues across the nation are taking a pass on achievement. We can't afford that. We cannot afford, my students, I don't know about anybody else, but my students cannot afford for us to take a pass on achievement for a year. So we're still going to do our main job, which is to close and narrow the achievement gaps. We still have a goal of 1.7 years of growth in 1 year's time. And the question for us is, how do we do that instructionally? And we know we can't do that totally remotely. So that's what we're doing.
I appreciate that, Mike, and I applaud the work you're doing and that you have the track record and you have true goals in mind. So thank you. I want to move to a question that came to us from one of our alumni here, and I know she's not on the call, but unless you are, I think I looked, but Mary Cipollone, I think I'm saying that wrong, but she has a question, and all of you are up for answering this. Elizabeth would also be interested in your perspectives on this or any thoughts, but given the inequities and long-term impacts that we know delaying school opening will have on students of color in low-income households, why aren't we seeing more creative solutions for in-person education? And I think, Susanna, this is a lot looking at DPS since you're not opening, and I wonder if you'd be willing to answer that.
Yeah, so sure, thank you. So, while we are waiting for the framework for school reopening, we also are still at the same time looking at how we can provide more in-person supports to students, particularly for our low-income students who have really struggled with remote learning. We will begin childcare and learning centers where we can have small groups of students who are able to come into our buildings to receive support both through internet access, adult supervision, and food service, because we know that's really important. We're working on plans to hopefully begin to bring back our youngest learners in early childhood. I saw in the chat several people who talked about students who are 3, 4, 5 years old. It's very challenging for any students at that age to meaningfully engage through technology. Not impossible, but certainly much more challenging. A lot of what we want our children to learn at those ages also are in the fine and gross motor development, in the pre-literacy skills that we know are going to be a lot easier to do in person. Part of early childhood has some ideal circumstances by licensing requirements. We have smaller classes. We believe that we can begin to bring our littlest kids back safely. And we want to be able to do so in collaboration with our teachers and our school leadership teams. I want to stress that one of the really challenging aspects, and in many ways I'm envious of Mike's ability on a smaller scale to start to implement changes more quickly. When we're talking about looking at a school system with over 200 schools, our ability to develop universal practices that we can scale out across a system, I think really do just require a different level of collaboration, both with local health experts, with our teachers, with our school leaders, and with our community members. And being able to do that in collaboration is the only way I see us being able to do this effectively and do so safely. It's going to be important for all of us to make sure when we are back in person that parents, for example, are helping out and making sure that they're using the health check guidelines, keeping kids home if they're not feeling well, all of us making sure that we're practicing good hygiene, using social distancing. It's going to be on all of us to keep the level of community spread down. I really want to give credit to Governor Polis for his efforts at making sure that we have good statewide policies around that, because the lower the level of community spread, the more likely it is that we'll be able to have in-person instruction in our schools.
Mike, anything to add, or Elizabeth, any thoughts on this topic?
I do. So yeah, definitely that's a lot. Like Mike said, he's able to keep it like socially distanced. That's like the biggest factor about going into schools, because literally in a school it's so germ infested. Like kids don't wash their hands, and kids put their fingers in their mouths, and this is coming from like middle school, high school. Like I still see this, and I was a high school student, so it's one of those things where you also have to keep, like, I understand the push on going back to school. Like, I totally understand that. For somebody that learns in school, like, that's something I would want to do. You know what I mean? If the option was on the table, let's do it. But also, you got to keep in mind, like, some kids struggle with personal hygiene, and things like that. And, like, some kids will be like, well, I don't want to wear my mask. And there's going to be some being defiant towards wearing a mask, and they're going to take it off, and they're not going to understand, like, one person, you taking off your mask and then somebody else taking it off, it just starts off with just being a big thing, And then it also comes down to the fact that, like, in low-income communities, you also have to think about a lot of our classes are overly crowded. Like, all my classes throughout all high school, it wasn't just 10 kids. Like, we would have 10 kids, and then they would have to enroll 20 more. So it's not to the point where there's no such thing as, like, you limit your enrollment, because in DPS they have this it's not like a rule, but like this guideline basically that it's like you cannot deny a student like enrollment in your school. I remember talking to my principal about this, and so it's like things like that. So it's not like they can say, well, there's COVID in the air, we can't enroll you into our school because we're overcrowded right now. It's like there's no such thing. Like, they can get in trouble for doing that. So if more kids come in, it's overly crowded in our classrooms, it's overly crowded in the schools. So then how do you manage where you're and then we don't have enough teachers. So are we going to put more teachers into the community and make sure that, like, okay, well, we're going to put 10 kids here, 10 kids here. Do we have enough teachers to have 10 kids to each person so we can socially distance? That's another thing that we have to keep in mind when it comes back to school. Like, I understood this because I worked for DPS through an apprenticeship, but I was also a student. So I understand both sides when it comes to this. And it's also about, like, the teachers. You also have to think about the teachers and their well-being, because they have families and husbands to go back to, and they have kids they have to look after. So it's all of this, like, there's a lot of aspects to going back into person learning that I understand. So it's one of those things where it's like, I understand the push for low-income communities, and I feel like with low-income communities, one thing that has to be on the table and, like, make sure that's known to every single family is definitely food. I know in like my community, everybody struggles with food, you know, but a lot of them don't know how to get to those resources. So making sure that is known to the students, like, hey, you can walk down to your local high school and go and get food because they're serving breakfast, lunch, and possibly dinner, you know. So things like that, making sure those resources are on the table is definitely going to be a big thing, because a lot of kids go to school for food. Like, I know a lot of people that will go to school and breakfast and lunch is their meal, and then they get no dinner, and then they go right back to school to get breakfast again. Right. So that's a big resource that's going to be needed within just in, like, if we're doing at-home learning, that has to be on the table. Another thing is, like, having access to counselors, because in my community, you know, there's depression, there's stress, there's anxiety, there's parents, there's, truth be told, but there's child abuse, you know, there's kids seeing domestic violence in their homes. So it's also things like that, like, how are we going to reach out to students with counselors? So I guess that resource is also going to be needed on the table, because kids are going to need someone to talk to, because school at times is their safe haven. School is where they go to escape everything that's happening at home. So I feel like that's a big thing that needs to be on the table, is counselors, resources, people to talk to, knowing there's numbers to call, knowing there's opportunities. So I feel like that's something we also have to open up and keep in mind when we're figuring out at-home learning, because not everybody has a stable home with two parents and has food to go home to every day. So I feel like understanding those perspectives is going to make it easier to figure out, well, where do we need to go, what needs to be available, what resources should be on the table for our students to get to easily.
So,
So,
I mean, Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly. Yeah, certainly there are all those considerations, and I understand the need to collaborate and get everybody's input, but at some point there has to be decisions, and we can go round and round because everybody has a different calculus. And so I think across the country, I would say to my colleagues and leaders, you know, at some point you got to decide. You have to use facts, but you know, you have to stop, you know, planning to plan. You have to stop getting committees together, make a good decision, and lead on that, because there are too many different groups that are using different variables to make their decision. And only the leaders can make, the instructional leaders and the leaders of the district or network or school can make those strong decisions. I did, and during a time of crisis, I think the public is more willing to let leaders make decisions as long as there's some rationale that makes sense. For example, you're following CDC guidelines or something like that. When I was in Dallas, we had Ebola. The only school district that had students who may have been exposed to Ebola, and obviously we were able to contain it. And we had to make decisions quickly, and the public just went along with it. Had we waited and got everybody's input, it would have been a real mess. So I don't want to be an autocrat, and I don't want to say that we don't get people's input, but I think at some point you just have to get input and then make a decision, and this is the time for it.
I appreciate that. I mean, what I'm hearing, certainly collaboration is always important. Leaders have to lead in the ways that they need to. And Elizabeth, what you spoke to is this isn't just about education, right? Specifically to this question, when we're looking at low-income families, it's not just education, it's everything else that has to be taken into account. So I appreciate that perspective. Again, if you have questions in the chat feature, feel free to put those in. Right as I said that, I see Vicki put one in. Vicki, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, you're welcome to do so. And there we go.
Thanks, Elizabeth. My question is really to Susanna. You described this framework, and I can only imagine how difficult and complex all these locations and boundaries and stakeholders are to put into your framework. But can you go into a little more detail about what that framework looks like and what the time frame is for publishing that?
I see you on mute, Susanna.
Sorry, I was just trying to get off mute. I was pulling up the document so that I could share it with you. So I believe really it's important for local health experts to develop this. I'm not a doctor, by training. I was a middle school and a high school teacher, an English teacher, and so I, can do a good job of reading and evaluating it, but I wouldn't have the expertise in terms of saying, what level of community spread, for example, would be acceptable or not acceptable. I really think it's important that the health experts are doing that. I can share with you the kinds of things that they're looking at using as part of possible metrics to consider. So one of the things that they're looking at is the 14-day case rate, which has been defined in Protect Our Neighbors as a way to determine where we are as a community. They're also looking at the trend in case rate over the past 2 weeks using a 2-week rolling average. They're looking at the percent positivity on PCR testing, and that's a way to determine if there's adequate testing in a community to make sure that actually what the level of spread is in the community. One of the things that they're considering is the level of hospitalizations of person with COVID. Part of what we have seen in Denver specifically is that there are very uneven rates of hospitalization across our community. And so certain neighborhoods are much more heavily impacted by COVID-19 than other neighborhoods. And so both looking at the overall citywide rates or countywide rates, as well as making considerations around specific neighborhoods. And then something that I think would be really helpful in our school district is looking at the amount of PPE supply that is on hand to determine that we can be open safely and do so in a way that provides the protection that employees and students would need within our building. One of the things that we found in March that was part of the tipping factor to help us make the decision to go into extended break was we had schools that were running out of soap, for example, at midday because of the increased emphasis on hand washing. And so if you're in an environment where you don't have enough supplies to do, the basic things that we need to be able to do to create a safe environment, that's a consideration on whether or not it is safe to be open. So my understanding is, and in fact, after this meeting, I have a meeting with doctors from Denver Health who are working on this, is that the Metro Denver Partnership for Health is looking at a collective approach to this across counties in the Metro Denver area so that there would be similar metrics. Cherry Creek did come up with an approach that they are using right now. They did that independently with Tri-County Health, and the Metro Denver Partnership for Health right now is working on this as a collaborative effort. I think it'll be very helpful across the metro area school districts to have a tool like that that helps us all determine using similar common data that's publicly available to demonstrate to our community why it's safe to be open.
Thank you. Thank you on Vicki's behalf. I'm sure you're saying that too, Vicki. I appreciate the deep dive into that. I want to kind of look at and ask all of you your thoughts on this, but how do the education gap and racial disparities play a role in decision making here? And piggybacking on that, who's in the room when you guys are making decisions? And I know, Elizabeth, this might have a different take for you, but I want to hear your thoughts on this as well. You gave a lot of great feedback, but who's in the room as you're making these decisions and having these conversations, and where does that education gap and where do racial disparities play a role? What does that look like for you? And Mike, maybe we'll start with you.
So even before COVID-19, we understood that there was an opportunity gap, that there were inequities inherent in the system. And so COVID-19 just brought that into stark relief. And what's really worrisome right now, as I think about public education, is I suspect that gap has grown over the last 5 months, the opportunity gap. And right now, what's happening in many communities with means, they're creating these pods. You've heard of it, right? 6 or 7 families getting together with their kids, or hiring a tutor or two, teacher, and they're getting the education they think their kids need. There are other families with means that are hiring private tutors. If you look, the number of tutors has grown exponentially. And so the people with means are able to educate the kids as they have always done the last couple hundred years. And the kids and the people without means are stuck and reliant upon the local system. And so it's dependent upon us, incumbent upon us, to provide pods and cohorts so that kids can learn and get the education they need. It is that essential, in my mind, to narrow the opportunity gap. We're not going to do it if we just keep kids home remotely. Again, the question is, how essential, what is the level of risk we're willing to tolerate, and how safe can we do it? And that's why, because we have an opportunity gap, and we need to make sure our kids get their education.
Great. Susanna or Elizabeth, anything to add? Susanna,
no, I think that's really accurate. Certainly, I think both the COVID-19 pandemic and then everything that has happened in our country that was revealed by the George Floyd murder, I think has just really laid bare the reality that we could see in schools, but frankly, people were not openly talking about in the way that we're talking about today. I think it's really important that we talk about this. In DPS, we're a large system. We are really pushing the need to create common language, to talk about systemic racism, to talk about the impacts of white supremacy culture on our policies and our practices, and to actively be anti-racist in how we approach our work. And I think that means there are times when we have to do uncomfortable things, including thinking about how we push to create opportunities for in-person learning for kids. I know that there are people who are really frightened by the prospect of it. And while the health conditions are safe, I think it's critical that we're moving forward. Fortunately in Denver, Denver and Colorado are not experiencing the same kind of trends as some parts of our country with COVID-19, and we need to be able to take advantage of this time while infection rates are very low and do so in a safe way.
wonderful. Thank you. Elizabeth, anything to add there? I know you're not in the war rooms, but.
Can you kind of repeat the question? I wasn't sure. I kind of got thrown off, but.
Yeah, it's because I threw 5 questions in one, but it's really looking at for those in the education system, how we are considering the education gap and racial disparities in making decisions. So are we taking that into account? And a lot of it's what you asked before, like, are we taking into account the need for food? And are we taking into account for counselors? And so it sounds like when you worked with DPS, you guys were thinking of that a lot, which is wonderful.
Yeah, definitely. So when I was in school also, my principal in maybe 5 or 7, I think it was. I don't know if you guys heard about it, but they were working on pushing DPS to include more Latinx and Black history into our learning. So I feel like that's another big thing we cannot backtrack on. I understand the opening. I understand COVID. I understand certain things like, trying to get us back in school. But another big push that we do need to work on is how we're teaching, because I'm tired of hearing the same Christopher Columbus since middle school. You know what I mean? I want to learn. I remember my junior year, I'm half Native American and half Mexican. in my junior year was the first time I had ever heard about Native Americans outside of the realm of, well, Christopher Columbus and the Thanksgiving dinner and things like that. That was the first time I learned about like the Wounded Knee massacre and things like that. I'm Native American and I'm here, and this was where they were living way before, you know, the foundation of the Constitution and things like that. So I feel like, yes, we're pushing on getting us back to school. Yes, we're pushing on safety precautions for, you know, things like that. But we also need to keep in mind, like, what are we teaching the kids? Because if we do go to remote learning, kids are not going to want to keep learning the same thing over and over again. At that point, kids are going to get bored. At that point, kids are going to check out. At that point, kids are going to be like, well, I'm not learning anything that seems to relate to me, so why am I going to keep going on your Zoom calls that from the beginning is hard for me to do? Like, kids are going to check out and kids are going to stop attending virtual classes because they're not interested or intrigued with what they're learning. So I feel like the context of what we're teaching our students, if they're not, like, from my perspective, if I'm not really learning about something that relates to me, I'll do it because, you know, I'm like a bookworm. You know, I love learning, but at the same time, I kind of like check out. I'm like, well, I don't know what to do for this project because it doesn't excite me. It doesn't make my mind flowing. It doesn't get me to the point where I'm thinking, oh, well, this aspect of something that I thought before. So it's like, if we are going to stay with virtual learning, we have to make sure our curriculum is more than what's being taught. Because at that point, like I said, students are going to check out if they're not interested in what's being taught or what they're learning. So I feel like that's another big thing that we have to keep in mind. Another part of it too, I know, like back to racial disparities, we're talking about like even going in person, we have to think about like the police in our schools, you know what I mean? So that's another thing that you see all the time that we need to think of too, because at that point, students of color feel like they're targeted in their communities. You know, you have the police sitting in your school, but it's like, that's something that, like, I know a lot of my peers feel really weird about. Like, why do we have a police officer sitting in our campus, like, ready to arrest us? You know what I mean? Going back to the whole George Floyd and all of the racism that we see within police brutality and the police system, you know, having that in our schools and our community, it almost makes us all feel like we're criminals already. Before we even commit a crime, having a police officer that's sitting in your high school watching you feels like you're already targeted in some way. So yes, we're worried about COVID, but at the same time, you can't brush past what was already happening before COVID popped up. You have to keep in mind that a lot of this goes back to how students feel, you know, and it all goes back to whether they're going to attend classes or not, or they're just going to check out. And now our dropout rates are far higher than they were before COVID because of racial disparities and not understanding curriculums and being in that situation where you feel like you're a criminal before you even commit a crime. And on top of that, like learning about things that don't directly relate to you, that make you interested, make you want to learn more. So I feel like that's something also we have to keep in mind when we talk about going back to school, is like not brushing past what was already being spoken on before.
What a golden nugget you hit on right there, Elizabeth. We can't, just because COVID's happening doesn't mean we have to forget about everything else we should be working on. So kudos to you for bringing that up. I think you're exactly right. Kind of a fun question that is just your opinions, but Elizabeth was talking about history. What do you think the history books will write about this moment in time for us? And what do you hope they'll write about the work you're doing and what you're accomplishing? Who wants to take that on first? Mike, you're not muted, so I'm calling on you, my friend.
Well, I'm hoping as a profession, we find a way not to go back to normal. I hope that history books will say the education profession and the leaders took advantage of this time to really look at what was wrong with the system before COVID-19 and then took the time to address those things and to really address systemic inequity. The virus will go. We will mitigate it. We'll get a vaccine. And at some point it'll be under control. I mean, I'm not saying it'll go forever. It'll probably always be here, but the vaccine will be able to mitigate some of the negative effects, and we'll be able to return to full classrooms. But the inequities are much harder to deal with, and I hope we take this opportunity to do that. And I also, and so that's one thing I hope they'll say. The other thing I hope we take this opportunity also to think about how essential and how professional our profession is. We haven't talked about it, so I'll just mention it just for a minute, but we haven't been honest to teachers, and we've not had the conversation. And the conversation is this: are you willing and prepared to teach in the year 2021? And what does it take to be a teacher in the year 2021? Just like I hope somebody talked to a new nurse entering the profession this last year, are you willing to be a nurse in this time frame? If the answer is no, then probably you shouldn't do that. What we did in our network is we've given everybody leave of absence without pay if they want it, and we pay for their health care. And only one person has taken advantage of that. But we've been honest and said, look, if you want to teach in this network, it means in-person learning, and the risk will be slightly elevated. We're going to have health, PPP and all that, or PPE and all that. But that's what it takes to teach this year. And I hope we find a way to be honest about that and to say, this is what an essential profession looks like. And in the end of the day, you have a choice to work.
Certainly essential profession. Susanna, you're unmuted. Did you want to tell us what
Sure.
your history book reads?
Sure. I have really been thinking a lot about how this is the kind of thing that will, probably never happen again in our lifetimes. And, for our young people, when they're old and looking back on this, or when we hear about it in history books, my hope is that what we remember is that while it's different and while it's unusual, that we preserve as much as possible about what childhood in school is supposed to be like. And I have a daughter who's a sophomore in college, and it's not going to be like my sophomore year was. And I think we all have to get our heads around the idea that it may not be like it was last year, but let's do everything that we can to preserve as much of what is important about this time in life for young people, about creating joy in learning, about creating community at the time that we are, when we are in virtual, and there will be times for all of us, even when we're in person, that we may have to go back and forth, that we do it in a way that preserves the really important things about learning, but also the important things that are not about the academic part of learning. It's about the social emotional part. It's about the connections. It's about the friendships. It's about the role models that teachers and leaders create for kids. And that while it may be in a non-traditional way, I hope when we look back on it, we can see how we were able to do that.
I agree. I'm glad you brought up the social emotional. Elizabeth, to you right before I ask our final question.
So I was thinking of the same thing. I've always thought about what would our history books look like, because when I look back 2 years from before and now read history book, I was like, I don't think I'll ever be a part of something like history. You know what I mean? It's just yeah, I understand, but I was but I don't think any big thing will happen. And I'm yeah, you're part of a history book. You look back at this and you'd be like, oh wait, I was a part of that. But I feel like this is going to make or break the perspective of school. This is going to make or break the perspective of education. And I say that because this is the time where you see as a student how important, especially a student of color in a low-income community, this is where you see how important you are to the district, how important you are to educators, how important you are to the system as a whole. Because this is where, like I mentioned, all of the factors that come into you being at home, the low supply on food, the mental health support, things like that, and having to do that from a distance, it shows how much effort your schooling and how much effort the district actually cares and how much they put into this, because this will determine because they can brush past it and be like, oh, here's some online courses, this is your work, you have to do it. It can be as simple as that, or it can be, you know what, here's some resources, here's how you can meet with a counselor on a Zoom call, or here's a phone number you can call when you're feeling down, or here's a phone number you can call when you're depressed. It also goes back to your teachers, like how much your teachers, because when it comes to education, I feel like it's not just about being a teacher. Like, I've always thought this, I've talked to my teachers about it, and they're like, yeah, but like, a lot of my teachers throughout high school got me through a lot of big problems with my own family. Like, in my own situations, I would go to my teachers and I would cry, and it was like, one of my teachers was a second mom, and another one would listen to me, and another one would be like, come over and, you know, like, come to my classroom and just, here's a shoulder to cry on. So it's like, teachers are more than just just being a teacher, you know? So I feel like that also shows the kind of connections you have, because I'm really close to my teachers. Like, I love all my teachers that I've come across, because they've always influenced me in the most positive way that I can think of. So that also goes into tying with like how people will look at schooling. Like, whether they'll be like, okay, my life matters at school more than just my grades and my GPA and what my transcript will look like after the 4 years and my test scores for standardized testing. It'll go into like, okay, well, my teacher was there when I needed help. My teacher FaceTimed me when I needed to talk about this problem outside of what work was about, because you can't be going through a lot of problems at home and focus on your grades. And that's just my perspective. Like, if I gave you a rundown of like I've been to 15 schools, let's put it that way. 15 schools. Like, I had my dad in prison all high school. I haven't been living with my mom for the last 2 years, and like, I still managed to graduate with 330 credits and 3.9 GPA, and I was part of DPS's apprenticeship, paid apprenticeship. I'm going to ASU, and I wouldn't have been able to do that successfully if I didn't have a support system at school. So that also goes into like why I say like it make or breaks what students.
Oh, we lost your connection for a minute, Elizabeth.
Successful. Like, well, my teachers pushed me, and they were there besides looking at my test scores. So you know what? I'm going to keep going, because I know I might not have the support at home, but I have the support at school that they'll continue to be there for me. And even my freshman teachers, I would go to my junior year, because I knew they were there, because they were still watching out for me, and they were still there to support. And my math teacher from my sophomore year helped me out with my senior work, because I didn't understand how to get there, and she helped me with that, but now in a more complex way. You know what I mean? So I feel like that's very important to understand. And another thing is like I said, with teachers, they do a lot. So I feel like that's another thing, is like that'll also determine whether people will go into education for schooling, because teachers don't get paid enough. And like I said, they don't just teach. They're counselors. They're moms, and you need them to be moms. They're ride home if you need to ride home. There are ways to like for them to talk to your parents. There's things like that. So I feel like that also goes into like, are we going to pay our teachers more for being sanitizing and bringing in supplies, because they don't get paid enough to bring out of their own pocket to buy wipes and sanitation cloths and like tissues, and at this point masks. So then after that, like it's also determining how our education system feels if our education like districts feel that our teachers are essential, and if they are essential, then how are we going to reward them, and how are we going to thank them from here on out? Are they going to get paid more? Because they're the reason why we have doctors and lawyers, because they start with teachers, you know? So I feel like that's another thing that we need to consider, and will go down in history, is like, what did we do after COVID to support our teaching, and who will be a teacher next, and things like that. So I feel like that's very important.
I think you're so right, Elizabeth. I think we can all agree that hopefully history books will talk about teachers for truly what they are, not just teaching our children, but bringing them into their lives and guiding them through every moment that they go through. I know we all have a teacher we can talk about in the same way you do, about really helping us through something. So thank you for that. Before we wrap, I have one final question. I'm hoping you can each answer in 30 seconds or less, just so we can get everybody off on time. But there were a lot of questions from the audience, and it's always one that I like to ask as well, is what can we do? What can our leadership network do to support you and the work you're doing? Some of the specific asks are, how can we support families that are struggling sending their kids back to school? Or can we volunteer in a virtual way? Or what can we do? Doesn't have to answer those questions, but what can we do to support you guys in this? And as we close, and I'll call on you, Elizabeth, first, just to give me a 30-second answer on what we can do to help you. For the audience, if you could please, in the chat feature, just throw in what some of your takeaways have been from this call. We'd love to just capture your thoughts and what you've been pulling from this as we answer. So in 30 seconds, Elizabeth, what can we do to help?
If I'm being honest, I do have a financial gap. So if you guys know people that I can reach out to and give my story and get interviewed or things like that, I definitely would be greatly appreciated. I do have like not a huge gap, but it's pretty big, you know. So if you guys have any networks, anybody I can email, anybody I can reach out to, organizations that will donate on my behalf, things like that, scholarships, I would greatly appreciate that. And yeah. Thank
Elizabeth,
you all for the comments too.
You should put your email in the chat feature, Elizabeth, so folks have that.
Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Susanna?
Great. So I'd say two things that would be really helpful. So always appreciate support through our DPS Foundation. The DPS Foundation both is the philanthropic arm of DPS, but they also help organize volunteering for DPS. And so it would be great to have people who have the ability to volunteer virtually with our students as we get this school year started. A space where we know that we could use some support. We have close to 10,000 computers that we've ordered that are in customs right now. And so if your organizations have additional laptops, that would be a place that we would love to get some donations so we can make sure that we close the gap for all of our kids to have technology throughout the school year. But the DPS Foundation would be a terrific way to get involved.
Or if we have connections at the border, right, to get those through customs. Mike, off to you, 30 seconds.
Generally, resources matter, and so any influence on legislators or policymakers about ensuring that the state receives educational support so that passes through to our PPOR, that's going to be huge. We're surviving this year with a 5% or 4.5% cut to PPOR, and I'm hoping next year won't be as bad, but who knows, it may be worse, and we're going to need both state and federal help to ensure we can really provide a good education for kids.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that's things we can all consider. As we wrap up, I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Mike, Susanna, Elizabeth. What a treat it was to have your expertise, your thoughts, your perspectives. Really a treat. I greatly appreciate that. And then as we wrap, I just want to remind you of future Virtual Voices. We've got 2 more on the docket. On August 27th, we have Race in the Workplace, where we're going to be talking about really what that means to consider our people of color in your workforce. We also are going to look at September 10th, mental health and mental awareness and mental wellness. So please join us for those. We hope to see you there. Finally, we have Impact Denver Nonprofit Community Project Proposals. We seek out nonprofits to let us know how we can help with a project. And our Impact Denver class will gather around, pick proposals, and then provide free expertise and free help to help you accomplish whatever your goals are. So if you'd like your nonprofit to apply, or if you know somebody else, the link is also going to be sent in the chat feature, but we are excited to see all of you today. Thank you so much. Again, Mike, Susanna, Elizabeth, greatly appreciate you being here today, and we'll talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.